Awesome. All right. Well, I just want to say hello to everyone and a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this live Q&A. I'm Crystal Siltman. I'm the Farmer Training Program Manager at the Land Connection. For those of you who are just now connecting with our work, the Land Connection, we are a food and farming nonprofit based in Champaign, Illinois. We provide farmers, food businesses, and eaters with education and support they need to successfully participate in our local food system. The primary ways we do this are through events like today, other types of trainings, field days, conferences, online resources, etc. We are actually now housing the Idea Farm Network, and we're very proud of that. The Idea Farm Network is a farmer-led community that shares innovative practices and shares or supports peer-to-peer learning. And so as a part of our work, TLC hosts events like today's webinar to just showcase real-world examples of problems farmers face in the field, and then to provide an opportunity for folks to connect and share solutions. At this point, I'm sure you're all familiar with Zoom, but just a little bit of housekeeping here. I just want to make sure that, stay on mute if you're not asking a question. You can unmute to ask a question. And then this is actually the desktop version. So if you're on a mobile, it may not look like this. And then finally, so you know, the session is being recorded. So everyone who registered will get a link once it's uploaded in case you missed any questions or you want to rewatch. And I'd like to start by introducing the folks who will be presenting information throughout this webinar. And I'll hand it over to them. They can introduce themselves and we'll get started.
All right. Thanks, Crystal. Appreciate it. Thanks to the Land Connection for hosting this. We're hoping to kind of cover some of the more practical, pest management strategies, as well as covering it kind of from the scientific angle with Kacie here. So we'll get into our presentation. So we have a brief presentation for you all. And then we're going to open it up for questions. We probably don't even have enough time to cover everything in our presentation. So feel free to jump in and ask questions. And we want to kind of, let you kind of steer the conversation. We can jump through slides as needed. So, but yeah, just a quick intro. My name's Evan Berry. I own Downriver Farm. I have about a decade of vegetable production experience now, mostly organic. So that's kind of going to be the angle I'm coming here from. And we're mostly selling direct to consumer. And I've worked on many different sized operations, but still mostly in the sub 15 acre vegetable production.
And I'm Kacie Athey. I am the Specialty Crops Entomologist for the state of Illinois. I'm an assistant professor at UIUC in crop sciences, and my research primarily is on non-chemical control of insect pests in fruits and vegetables.
And feel free to, if you have questions, chime in with your microphone or raise your hand or shoot us a message in the chat, and we'll try to address those as they come up. Yeah, so the whole, a common kind of utterance among us vegetable growers, especially in the organic world, is that as long as we have perfect soil, proper nutrition, we remove all plant stressors at all critical points of growth, then we're not going to have any pest issues, right? That's what Elliot Coleman kind of pioneered. So we'll just end right there, right? Yeah. No, that's not really the reality, though. There's going to be plant stressors no matter, because we're dealing with the weather and stuff like that all the time. And there's no way to really remove all those plant stressors. And even if we did remove all the plant stressors, we'd still probably have pest issues. So we're going to kind of come at this assuming that, a lot of times trying to fix plant health issues, soil health issues is kind of the primary mode of response, but realistically, you also have to deal with the pests themselves. So Kacie's going to talk a little bit here about IPM and pest management more specifically.
Yeah. So, when we think about pest management too, The other thing on top of everything else is that so many pests are unpredictable. We have pests that migrate in during the season. And so no matter how well your operation is with all the other wonderful things you do, there are things that are going to pop up potentially that, you know, are hard to predict. And so eventually some sort of control mechanism is probably going to have to be used. But I always like to start here with the idea of pest management. And so pest management is just reducing the impact of a pest. That's all we're talking about here. That doesn't necessarily, and in fact, most of the time, does not mean you kill everything. Sometimes you don't kill it at all. You just make it go someplace else, or, you know, cover your crop, some other thing. And so, of course, for, you know, growers in the organic side, this is common knowledge that this is a lot more than just using an insecticide, and, you know, goes back to what Evan really was starting with. Next slide. So I like to do the actual definition of IPM here, and highlight some words. It's sustainable. Integrated pest management is to be science-based, and it's a decision-making process. So you have to be doing something. You know, it's not old-style calendar sprays where you're like, well, I'm going to be spraying every 7 days, and that's what's going to happen. That's really not necessarily an IPM strategy, because it's not taking into account all the things, the sort of holistic approach to farming. And the tools that we tend to use with this are things like biological tools, cultural and physical tools, and chemical tools tend to be part of this. And the other thing that's important about IPM is it's trying to minimize the overall economic, health, and environmental risks of farming. So as we know, you know, especially large scale row crop production, there can be a lot of environmental hazards and health risks too with widespread chemical use, things like that. And so the idea with IPM is that we're trying to minimize those things as well as minimizing the economic risks for individual farmers by using these sorts of techniques. Next slide. And I always like to mention, I kind of mentioned this a little bit, but before we were thinking about integrated pest management, I would say that pest control often had what we call a scorched earth approach, where it was just kill everything, spray all the time, use these broad spectrum insecticides. Everybody, most people know about DDT and these sorts of approaches, or as I mentioned, using things like calendar sprays. And so we're not doing that anymore. And really, we're not doing that anymore even in large scale conventional production, but certainly you're not doing that in organic production. And that was probably never really the philosophy there, but it's important to remember that a lot of production, in fact, followed this philosophy for a very long time. Next slide. And then again, as I mentioned, these things are important benefits of IPM, and I think reducing risks to the public too. I mention this here because although we're talking about farming today, we do use integrated pest management in sports fields, residential areas, parks. And so the fewer chemical inputs we can do, the more decision making we can do, we're definitely reducing the risk to the public writ large by just spraying fewer things in areas that most people come in contact with. And then, of course, bringing in these other techniques. My picture is of a parasitoid wasp, which can be used in, you know, biological control as well, which greatly benefits from IPM for sure, being able to incorporate biological control. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, and again, this may be something that a lot of you already know about, but as I mentioned, integrated pest management is a decision-making tool. So there are specific steps that we take when we utilize integrated pest management. And up front, and Evan's going to talk about this, we're going to talk about this quite a bit, are things like cultural and physical controls, which we'll talk about. And generally speaking, you're doing that before you're planting. You may be doing it through the season too, but you're at least thinking about it before you're planting. You have to plan ahead for this. So this is sort of step 0 in IPM, if you will. And then the next step is monitoring and identification. You got to know what the pests are in your area or in your farm, and you have to identify them correctly. And there's a variety of ways we do that. And then this third one is kind of hard. So this is establishing action thresholds. So this is the number of pests you would have that would signify you have to do something about that. So with our action thresholds, often you go out and you scout and you see the number of pests, and the answer is to do nothing, often, because the pest numbers are not high enough to make any difference. So your action threshold, your pests don't reach that level, you don't have to control. Action thresholds are hard to establish, they're hard to do in research, and they're very dependent on lots of factors. So often for pests, we don't actually have this, but I will mention in a little while the occasions where we do. Or next, I should say. And then, of course, once you have your action threshold, you can do controls, and then evaluating effectiveness is just looking at yield, looking at, your pest numbers at the end of the season, that sort of thing. So next slide. So when I mentioned monitoring and action thresholds, I wanted to just give you some examples of places we actually do have action thresholds for various pests. And these are direct counts. So this is where you're just going out in your field and you're scouting. Whether or not you're scouting, like I'm going to look at 5 different leaves and I'm going to count the number of things on those. These are action thresholds that are based on counts. So tobacco hornworm, the action threshold there is 1. It's a presence absence question. For flea beetles over in the right corner, you're counting these when your plants are really small. So you're monitoring this action threshold is when your seedlings are less than 4 inches tall, and then you're looking for 4 beetles per plant. Cucumber bugs, or cucumber beetles and squash bugs are both situations where it's presence absence. So the action threshold is, are they there? Yes, do something. If not, then don't. Whereas with our flea beetles, if you only have 3, you can ignore it and then keep monitoring as the time goes on until your seedlings are big enough. So that's sort of the first type of monitoring. Next slide. And then the other one is through the use of traps. So these are using pheromone traps. Pheromones are just things that bugs of the same species use to to communicate with each other. And in vegetables, we have 2 that are really commonly used. So squash vine borers, which again is that pest that often if you grow zucchini and your zucchini looks really happy, and then one day you go out and it's entirely wilted, it's probably this guy. There are traps available for those. And if you're using the traps, you're looking for 5 adults per trap per week. If there's less than 5 adults, you do nothing. And corn earworms are one that if you're growing sweet corn, and actually the picture I have here is tomato, you're probably monitoring for these guys. And this has a spray interval that's important based on the numbers of moths in the trap. So if you're getting 1 to 10 moths every night, you're spraying every 5 days for these guys. If you're getting 100 moths per night, you're spraying every 2 days. And those numbers tend to jump really, really quickly. And so these are just examples of established action thresholds using monitoring for some of the pests that we deal with in vegetables. And then again, for a lot of things, we don't really have numbers quite like this for your action thresholds, which is one of the harder areas to establish in IPM. Okay, and next slide. I'll transition to Evan for a bit.
All right, I'm going to take over here. So we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about these are kind of the same things that she just said, but put in slightly different terms. And I'm going to talk through a little bit about some of these more specifically as they were, as you see them in the field. So prevention is sort of your cultural controls. Like Kacie said, this is sort of your step 0. And honestly, I find that a lot of what I end up doing is, revolves around this step. I find that, while I made a joke about it earlier about plant health and everything being perfect, and then you'll get no pests, I do find that, the healthier your soil is, the healthier your plant's going to be, and it's going to have the strength to ward off pests. just like kind of when you're stressed at work, that's when you are more likely to get sick or catch a cold. And I find the same is true with plants and pests. You know, when you have a sick plant, that's when it's more likely, or, you know, a plant that's not getting all the nutrients it needs or having to deal with certain environmental stressors, that's when you're going to see pests start to move in and, you know, try to eliminate those sick plants. So soil health, and we can dive into any of these more specifically. These are obviously just some of the overviews, but soil health, dealing with organic matter levels in your soils, remineralizing your soils, and then addressing soil compaction and utilizing cover crops in some instances. Plant health, you know, making sure that you're getting proper spacing. Do they need more space, less space? Irrigation, irrigation schedules and consistency. Selecting your varieties if you are dealing with, you know, vegetables. Overplanting for your market needs in the event. Just knowing that pests are going to move in at some point, and it's better to have too much than too little. And then really, like, a lot of what my job is reducing plant stressors from these plants, whether it's heavy rains, droughts, heavy wind, which in my case is honestly the biggest plant stressor that I have. You can see in this photo here that I'm fairly surrounded by corn and soybeans. So there's a lot of open fields and a lot of wind moving in. And then tillage. So making sure that we're tilling at appropriate times in the season, as well as making sure our soil moisture levels are proper. You're not tilling when it's super dry or too wet. And then I put in here, you know, trying to minimize tillage if and possible. And no-till is something that I've experimented with, and a lot of people kind of say it's like the solution to all of your problems, and I don't really agree with that. I've tried no-till a few times, and actually what I found was that different types of pests moved in. So as soon as I did no-till, I started seeing a ton of slugs, which I had never seen prior when I was using tillage. So I think that is also making a case for, like, you know, proper tillage, appropriate tillage can actually help with some pests in certain instances. And you're just making sure that you're looking at this from a full holistic perspective. If you are going to do no-till, you have to have a plan for how you're going to address slugs or, you know, other issues that you're going to see from that strategy. And then physical control or avoidance. So this is using like row covers or insect nettings. I love row cover. I absolutely love it. As far as like keeping pests off of crops, it's honestly like, as long as they're like flying insects, not worms so much, but it's honestly the most effective strategy. And if I could just put all of my plants under row cover and it never get ripped, I would do that. But that's not always economically viable. And then insect netting is also obviously great. Like Protect Net is a brand that is great because it has no insulation value, whereas row cover you can use for frost protection. And it'll probably, Kacie and I were talking earlier, and she'll talk about it a little later, of a case when stuff under row cover got overheated because it's too hot, when their intended goal was to keep squash beetles off, cucumber beetles off of a crop. But insect netting is a lot more expensive. And then planting multiple successions of crops, sometimes treating them differently in different seasons. So sometimes I'll direct sow versus transplant, or I'll transplant versus direct sow in different seasons, honestly. Like transplanting spinach in the fall has deemed to be more successful for me because I had a lot of issues with cutworms and armyworms destroying newly germinated spinach seeds in the fall. So I moved to transplanting them, and that worked a little bit better. Interplanting is something that I do. I don't know that it's much of a pest mitigation strategy. A lot of people think that companion planting is going to solve all your problems. And I think it has a big part in it. I think you should try to plant, you know, it's probably a good strategy to have like sweet alyssum in with your tomatoes, or a variety of different flowering crops among your annuals, as well as having a variety of different perennials among, it's more just having as much diversity as you can. And Kacie probably has more like scientific knowledge of companion planting. And that's where I also include like having hedgerows and trap crops and beneficial attracting plants, and just having as much diversity as you can is very, very effective.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, with all of these examples, there are specific ones that work really well.
Mm-hmm.
A blanket statement about trap cropping or companion planting being an answer, as you mentioned, is not the case, but there are certainly ones that work really well for this versus others, for sure.
And then, yeah, one of the like more physical controls when you do begin to see small amounts of pest pressure is manual picking the pests, particularly with hornworms. I've worked on farms where we would spend hours just picking hornworms and potato beetles, honestly, because there's not many other strategies that will contain them in a short period of time that they'll do a ton of damage. And then squash bug eggs as well as. And then sometimes I just cut crops altogether. I just don't even deal with it. Like, I'm on a small enough scale where it's just not going to be economically viable, and I'm just not going to even try, and I'll just cut it from my crop plan. So here's an example of some row cover on the left here. This is a bed of radishes from the spring, free of flea beetle damage, which is usually what my primary use of row cover is for brassicas. Kacie, you can talk about that photo on the right there.
Yeah. So I wanted to include this photo because this was from an experiment that we did during my PhD, where we were looking at the remay, so the row covers, they're sort of in the foreground, and then the Protect net in the background. And we were looking at them on muskmelon and acorn squash. And we had a variety of reasons for looking at them, but primarily we were in Kentucky, and if you're growing cucurbits, so squashes and melons, in Kentucky organically, you have to cover them because the cucumber beetles are such a problem, and we have a lot of bacterial wilt. So that's what we were looking at. And it turns out that the other effect was, because this row cover, if you leave it on when it's hot, one of the years, all the muskmelon under there died. Our little transplants all died because they got way too hot. And so you take this chance of every couple of years, your whole crop dies. And that did not happen under the Protect net. The other cool thing about this experiment is we wanted to see if we could get season-long extension under the Protect. So we bought bees. We bought bumblebee boxes and put them under the Protect net and just let them do their thing. And we never uncovered it. And so we ended up, it worked really quite well. And there was not a yield difference between having it like that and not the whole time, but the cantaloupe were huge. They were absolutely gigantic because they just were pollinated to, the nth degree, if you will. And so that Protect netting worked really well for us for those applications.
More row cover. Yeah, monitoring. I'm going to try to fly through these. I'm like, man, time goes so fast.
It does.
So monitoring, obviously, I'm out there at least every week. So every Monday I go out with a clipboard and a sheet that I've drawn up, and I'm monitoring for pest issues or other issues that I need to address. Obviously, proper ID is super necessary if you're trying to determine how to solve a problem. Yellow sticky traps are outstanding. I especially in your propagation house, if you're having pest issues in a propagation house, having yellow sticky traps is really helpful for monitoring. And then using those in conjunction with a jeweler's loop. I don't know if you can see my screen in the corner, right? So this is a little jeweler's loop. I love using these on a sticky trap so you can really see up close what you're dealing with. They're very cheap, so it's kind of a nice tool to have in your tool bag. Nowadays there's app IDs, stuff like that. I'm waiting for the day when AI can properly identify pests, which we're not really there yet. I tried prior to this and it did not work.
Nope. And I will say the app IDs aren't always great either.
Yeah.
You got to be grain of salt with those too.
Yeah.
Still.
I find the best resource has always been my mentors and local farmers, and just posting to like Facebook groups. Facebook groups, you know, you can get some iffy responses. You have to kind of weed them out and get a consensus. But yeah. And then determining whether it's economically viable to do an intervention and maintain the profitability of that crop is really, you know, some cases spray might be more expensive than the price, than the value you're actually going to get for the crop, in which case, what's the point? So.
Yeah, so that actually goes nicely into here because, you know, we do have a variety of organic insecticides that we use for a bunch of different pests. I think one of my favorites is the BT sprays Dipel. If you got caterpillar problems, it works really well. I work a lot in high tunnels. It works really well in high tunnels. Of course, it has a short residual, so in your field, it's only going to be div for, you know, a day or two probably, but it will, once those caterpillars ingest, it works really well. Insecticidal soaps work for small soft-bodied things, aphids, mites, these sorts of things. Entrust works really well. It has really good efficacy against a lot of stuff. As Evan mentioned, it's the price problem. When you're thinking about it economically, Entrust is pretty expensive. Being not conventional growers, there aren't a lot of cheap options for this. And so these decisions as to when to use these products. And I list Pyganic here. Pyganic doesn't always show as good of efficacy, but it's got pretty good efficacy against a bunch of things. And then oils for smothering eggs. If you're gonna use chemical control, no matter if it's organic, I don't care what it is, read that label. Always read your label. Make sure you know how to properly use it. It's just a PSA now and forever. But, you know, understanding that often in these decision-making schemes, you may not choose to use any of these things, but there are things available out there for you. I will mention a lot of people use neem. I'm not going to tell you shouldn't use neem. There is not a lot of evidence that neem is effective against a lot of things. If it works for you, please keep using it. But it's one of those things that, because it's inexpensive, it makes sense to use. But the evidence of its effectiveness against various pests is, you know, it's shaky. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add to this is like my kind of go-to if I'm having issues that need addressing immediately, is I have not found a lot of like Kacie just mentioned, I haven't found much success with neem oil. However, I do use it because it's cheap and it's more of like covering more bases. So I use it in conjunction with other things. Like she said, read your labels, make sure you can combine these certain products together. But like my go-to has always been a Pyganic with an insecticidal soap, because the soap is a surfactant, so it helps that product stick to the crop a little better. And then also having a neem oil in there. And that's kind of covering a few different bases. The Pyganic is killing, and it's a very broad spectrum kind of thing, and it is cheaper than Entrust. But I am curious to maybe experiment more with Entrust. I've never used that product. But yeah, so okay. Maybe we'll go to kind of more questions at this point. If anybody has anything pressing, and then we can kind of jump around. We have some case studies we could go through as well, of some stuff I saw this year, as well as stuff that Kacie dealt with in her research. So if there are any specific questions, we can open it up at this point, and we'll take this where we want to take it.
I do have a question.
Excellent.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Circling back to the dirt itself, like prior to planting or whatever, like how often are you checking your dirt? Just before you plant something, or like consistently throughout the growing season, or what does that look like?
Like for pest?
No,
pest?
like in general, like you talked about.
Pest?
Kind of, yeah. Like you talked about making sure that you're tilling when the dirt is appropriate, and and then, you know, pest management. I know you said you do once a week kind of thing, but yeah, like how often are you assessing that, I guess?
Yeah, I basically in the springtime, I go out, like assuming that, you know, we haven't had a super heavy rainfall in the recent past, I'll go out and check almost every day. Because in the spring, I'm really, you know, I'm trying to get in as early as possible for certain crops. What I do to check for tillage and soil moisture is the cat poop test, where you take a handful of soil, you crumble it in your hands a little bit, and then you roll it. And if it makes a cat poop looking thing that's like firm, it's not, you can't till yet, it's too wet. But if it like crumbles, kind of just disperses through your hands, then you can go ahead and start working the soil. But yeah, I find that the earlier I can get in with most things, the better. And especially because like certain things like brassicas nowadays in the spring are so hit or miss with pest hatching cycles, like flea beetles, especially, where you could, if you plant too late on those, you're not going to get a crop. I mean, it's just like you have to get them in super early. And I found too that having that row cover also helps me keep that crop, the brassicas, and protected from frost super early. But yeah, so I want to get in as early as possible. And then as far as fall, it's I try not to work my soil in the fall if I can prevent it. I'd rather have it covered with something, even if it's just residue of plants. So yeah, but if I have to, I might till up a few, like a small plot, just so I have something that will dry out a little bit earlier in the spring.
Cool. Thank you.
I have a question. Thank you guys so much for doing this workshop. I was wondering if y'all have ever seen, through using mostly like I'm thinking about chemical controls, any damage to like beneficial insects and stuff. Sometimes I feel like I'm going real heavy on like diatomaceous earth, when I don't have enough like row row cover or insect cover. Yeah, have you guys seen any damage, or you feel like the stuff you're using honestly just knocks out the pests that you don't want?
Yeah, so at least for some of all of the organic products are softer on natural enemies, so they don't have the effect of, the bee issues or anything. Something like Entrust is probably going to take out some natural enemies a little bit, but not nearly as much as our broad spectrum insecticides. And then something like Dipel, if what you're dealing with is cucumbers, caterpillars, that thing won't affect anything that's beneficial, because it just only, goes after caterpillars. I shouldn't say goes after, affects caterpillars. And so they tend to be more friendly on natural enemies with a lot of the compounds people are usually using.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that is like that I think that's also where kind of appropriate spray timing comes into. I mean, I guess you're talking about diatomaceous earth, and that's not really obviously not a spray. But like, bees tend to come out when it gets warmer in the day, so not spraying in the middle of the day, making sure that you're spraying in the mornings, ideally as early as possible, is another way to help with that. Diatomaceous earth, I think you are just going to have, you are going to have some casualties, unfortunately, with that.
Well, and I will mention one more thing about the bees is you're probably not spraying anything that's really going to be super harmful to bees, but depending on what you're growing, you actually, even spraying way later in the day is better. So like squash bees actually come out before sunrise. They're very early guys. And so with sprays, sometimes we're kind of telling growers, depending on what you're spraying, to, if you can move it as late in the day as is humanly possible. That's usually not very practical because we're asking people to do it very, very late. But just to keep in mind that some of the bees are doing their thing real early in the morning. Some of our natives anyway. But yes, generally speaking, you don't want to be spraying in the middle of the day, for, bumblebees, honeybees, these sorts of things that, might be out during those times.
Thank you so much. I do have a second question really quickly. Um,
Mhm.
when you gave the cantaloupe, the covered cantaloupe example,
Mhm.
like how you bought bee boxes and kind of released them to have some pollinators for your covered crop, um, can I ask like what was like the general cost? I've never heard of anything like that. It sounds really cool. I was just wondering like how costly was that? Um,
Boy, that's a good question. I have to look back and then see
okay.
how expensive it is today. So what we bought, we purchased the bee boxes from Coppert, and Coppert sells bumblebee boxes in a variety of sizes. So we bought the smallest ones we could, because what we had is we actually had 3 rows. They're relatively small plots. We had 3 rows of muskmelon. I can't remember how many feet long it was. And then we just left them alone. Basically the whole season to do their thing. It is relatively expensive the way we did it. I think there's been subsequent research since then showing a much larger area that you can cover with the same amount of bees. And so then that would decrease your costs for sure. I know that some pumpkin growers here in Illinois are supplementing pollinators already. So I have some growers down in the Arcola area that are buying large bumblebee boxes and putting it in their open fields. And so, depending on what kind of pollination you need, um, it's nice because it keeps all the pests out, and it keeps the bees in. And we
So I
actually
assume
went under,
there's,
we went under the covers and did sampling, and the bees did not bother us.
so I'm assuming with that instance, because the bees are there for pollination, you're not removing the row cover at
Nope.
flower set.
Nope, we didn't remove it at anthesis at all. We left it covered the entire season. Yep.
Yeah, and that one thing too I'll say about row cover, which I learned this mistake the hard way, is putting it over a giant plot. I had a big plot at a different farm I was working on, maybe a half-acre plot that we threw it over for spring brassicas, and worked great, except getting into cultivate was an absolute nightmare. So,
Yes.
in that instance, were you guys planting them on plastic or fabric?
Yeah, so they were on the rows were on plastic, but there was bare ground in between. And so we had bare ground and we had straw ground cover. And the biggest problem we had was, in fact, weeds. It just was. So that was the thing to overcome more so than anything else. Because once it was covered in a closed system, everything but the weeds worked beautifully.
Yeah,
And the bare ground was nonsense that way, right?
yeah.
It was just going to be weeds. And so we had to go in and weed, which you would not do on a large scale production, because we actually went underneath. We didn't open it, and we weeded under there, and it was kind of a nightmare. Yeah. So a
One question
ground
that
cover is the other important thing here. You got to have a good ground cover.
yeah, tagging off Rachel's there question. In terms of using beneficials, that's not something I've done a whole lot of. Like releasing ladybugs to handle your aphid pressure, stuff like that. Um, I can see its efficacy in a closed environment, but I
Yes.
hear a lot about people doing it just in their fields, and I always wonder if like they're just going to fly away and find other things. How effective has that been in research?
Yeah, so for open field biocontrol, if you're purchasing biocontrol agents in open fields, it's not super effective. To your point, it's just not. Um, the one thing people have been looking at are things like parasitoids, where you put them out and they go after the eggs. So you're releasing them on cards, essentially already in eggs, to come out at the exact right moment that the pests would be out there, and then they go to those eggs. Eh, it's it's definitely better for anything that's protected. So high tunnels, greenhouses, things like that, at least for the moment. That's really where releasing biocontrol agents makes sense. Conservation biological control, where you're doing something, planting things to bring in natural enemies, changing the environment around to help prop up what's already there, that is probably much more useful in open fields. And we do have some efficacy that way. It just happens to be that the natural enemies usually, if you have, like wildflower strip or something, they will go in a couple of feet into your field, but they're not, you know, doing the whole thing. If you try to do like wildflowers and then whole field and then wildflowers on the other side, you'll see the effect of more natural enemies sort of on those borders. But that's, as far as biological control, that's what we are often focusing on in research in open fields, not so much the I'm going to buy bugs and release them in the field.
Mm. Any other questions? Any other specific pests that folks are dealing with or dealt with this season?
We have a
Hi,
question
this
from
is-
Cheryl, I believe.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
good
Yes.
job.
Hi. I'm here on behalf of our farm manager who couldn't make it, so bear with me. But we do have significant flea beetle damage in our greenhouses on our spring brassicas, and we're considering the use of nematodes. And so how do you feel about that? Any recommendations there? Is it effective? It's a consistent problem in the greenhouses.
So as far as nematodes on flea beetles, I actually don't know
Oh,
for sure the effectiveness of those things. A lot of the nematode work, would it be going after affecting the flea beetles
Eggs?
while they're in the soil, presumably?
Right. I
Yeah,
honestly,
Yeah, I mean, I feel like nematodes I've heard them being used for things like wireworms,
Mhm.
more like ground dwelling insects. So
Okay.
I see in your case though, where you might be targeting the eggs or maybe the larva stage of the flea beetle.
Mhm.
But yeah, in terms of flea beetles in a greenhouse, otherwise, I would probably go for a more like Intrust or a Pyganic type product if you have to use chemical control.
Okay. Yeah, we've read about using large fans to just keep them off the plants. Any other suggestions you all might have on the flea beetles?
Are you using row cover in there by chance?
We do, yes, but I think they might get it at a point. They think it's in the soil, I believe, right? So the eggs are in the soil.
Right. Yeah.
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 Yeah, that's
Yeah, I'm
one of the
curious.
benches.
Oh,
Go ahead,
here we go.
Kacie.
I'm just curious what the efficacy, because there are obviously nematode products for flea beetles, and I don't have a good sense for the efficacy of those. I'd have to look that up and see, because there's a lot of nematode work being done right now, and I think it's kind of promising. It's just that I don't know that we have a good handle on all of it, because a lot of the nematodes that are used are generalist nematodes, so they're
Mhm.
used for a variety of things, or sold for a variety of things.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. And on to our next problem. We have heard about 27 deer that hang on our
Oh.
farm.
Yeah.
We have 60 acres, so they're
Yep.
very comfortable.
Yes.
They, in the past, have taken out 1,800 tomato plants out of the
Yep.
blossoms, right? This year it was the sweet peppers. So we've used deer fencing, maybe not as much as we could, but any suggestions there?
Yeah, deer are a pain.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, deer fencing is really the best route, and making sure that it's tall, you know, at least like 6 feet or so, because they can jump pretty high. And then also, you know, if you do want to if you're on a huge amount of acreage, obviously that's not super practical. So I have seen farms using like the chicken fencing netting stuff. I forget what it's called, and then electrifying it. And that also, they kind of get tangled up in that a little bit too. So it's I would maybe try to add, even if you use that and then run another wire or a couple wires of electrification to it. That might be your only solution, honestly.
Yeah.
And we do have like a thoroughfare where they mostly graze and kind of go from area to area. which is where both of those incidents have happened. So, all right, thank you. I'll pass that on. Much appreciated.
Yeah, vertebrates are a huge problem and they're really hard to deal with. There's not easy solutions. Insects are hard, but I can give you a variety of solutions. Can't so much on the vertebrate problem.
We'll keep feeding them a little bit then, I suppose. So, oh my gosh. Thank you.
I would do too, like some of the preventative things with flea beetles are like getting to them before you start seeing issues. You know, I don't, so, you know, like doing pretty early controls. If it is like a rule, so to speak, instead of the exception where you're seeing it every year in your spring brassicas in the greenhouse, maybe doing younger sprays of it. And also whenever I'm doing like sprays of preventatives, I also try to add nutrients into those sprays too, as long as the labels say that you can, just to give them a little bit more micro macro foliar nutrients that might help ward off the pests as well. So yeah, if I am going to take, I hate spraying, like I absolutely hate it.
Yes.
So I try to do it as little as possible. And if I do it, I'm going to foliar feed and I'm going to get my pest issues in control. I like the Advancing EcoAg AEA products. They have a lot of foliar sprays that are biologicals, and they can cover a lot of your bases in terms of giving, not only warding off those pests, but giving the plant what it needs to ward the pests off itself.
Right.
Yeah, we talk about in insect control, we talk about early season a lot. So a lot of things, if you can get them right away, very, very early, and you can knock that population down as early as is humanly possible, it doesn't have time to build up through the season then. And so if you're having that big a problem with flea beetles, scouting when they are tiny seedlings and making sure that you are doing some sort of control when, you know, there's only a few there. My economic threshold there for flea beetles in the crop that one came from was 4 of them on a seedling. You know, like that's not very many. Flea beetles are tiny.
Perfect. We'll give it a go. Thank you.
Good luck. Flea beetles are the worst.
And it looks like Emily has a question. Any suggestions on voles, moles, field mice, and squirrels?
Yeah. Oh yeah. And I see voles in here, man. Voles are the worst too. Oh, yeah. Mice, mice, I see most mice damage in my prop house. So I'm like always setting up mouse traps, with voles and moles. And I think mice, this could help with as well. At one point I made just like little covered boxes, and then I put a few mouse traps in them just out of wood with a little, you know, a little entrance hole targeting voles primarily. And I would stick them like right next to the crops that would often get damaged from them, like sweet potatoes primarily. But in the fall, voles kind of go after everything. And that was a pretty easy thing to make, and it was very effective. You know, as long as you're on top of, you know, emptying those traps.
Yeah.
But it's probably not going to solve the problem entirely. It's just going to mitigate it, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's probably an ongoing thing if you're using trapping for vertebrates, which is often kind of the only option that you have. That's a thing you'll just have to keep doing.
Any other questions for Evan and Kacie?
I think next, Evan, if you'd like to pick one of your examples from our case studies, whichever one you like the best.
Oh man, I like them all.
Any
Let's see.
input on cats, on barn cats? Somebody, Rachel just asked.
Oh
like,
yeah,
barn
yeah.
cats to be really effective.
Great point. Yeah. If you're dealing with squirrels or mice or anything like that, cats are really effective. And we also have a, you know, part of the reason having a dog helps too, with deer, and like raccoons in corn, for example. I worked on a farm where we would, set up a T-post and hook up a dog, like an LSG, livestock guardian dog, to ward off raccoons in corn, and that was pretty effective.
There's some
If it's
research
an outdoor
happening.
dog, don't.
Yeah. There's some research happening on robot dogs to scare away deer. Currently, we'll see where that goes.
Let's see. Japanese beetles are boring. Target plant bug is this is actually a pest that I never saw in any other operation I worked on until this year. Or maybe I just didn't identify it properly prior. And Kacie helped me with the idea on this one as well, confirmed it for me. Especially in fall lettuces, I was seeing a lot of this damage on some of the inner leaves. And it's really impactful because that crop is no longer sellable at that point. So as soon as I saw any sort of damage from that, I had to act pretty quickly. It seemed to happen when the beans and corn came out right near me, and pests are then flooding to find other sources to eat. You can see the damage there on the left. And in this case, I didn't really have many other options because it had already progressed too far to where it was maybe half of my crop had been affected at this point. Had I caught it earlier, I would have done something different. But in this case, I just harvested what was sellable and then just mowed the rest of it under and planted something else. And that is unfortunately one decision you have to make as a farmer sometimes, is like, is this worth even it taking up the field space anymore, and also continuing to further the life cycle of that pest, as opposed to just mowing it under and taking the L like a champ. Yeah, and I did determine that, I think, like I said, this mostly happens. There's a closer up photo of it. It mostly happened in the fall, or only happened in the fall, really. But it also got into my broccoli heads, where it was like there were tons of them just crawling in and around my broccoli heads. And I found that it was mostly during the drought and the heat stress of the late fall this year that we had. It was like late September. I think I started to see these mid-September. And I thought in my head, well, the nights are cooler, so I think that, it'll be an okay environment for the lettuce. And it turned out not to be. So I think in the future, it would be making sure that the lettuce is getting shade cloth when the temps are getting really high, and then also making sure that I stay consistent with irrigation, even though the night temps are lower.
Yeah, and there are certainly a fair amount of pests that we don't usually see in certain things that are way worse when it's a drought makes them break out.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I find too that, when droughts happen, you start to see different pests coming in, and also a drought followed by a heavy rain is gonna, and I don't know if there's actual science to the life cycle of a pest. Maybe Kacie can speak to this, but I guess a good example would be the cabbage loopers in the broccoli, which this is kale, but you get what I mean. I find that I started to see them in the drought when, maybe there was a little more stress on the plants. But as soon as a rainfall happened, I found that there was a proliferation of them, because I think worms kind of prefer a more moist environment. So, if you do start to see them in a drought-like scenario, getting on top of them before you get that next heavy rainfall, rather than waiting to see if it'll be solved by a rainfall, which sometimes I do. And maybe Kacie can speak to the actual science of that. This is just bro science for me, but
well, I mean, the cabbage loopers are going to go after brassicas no matter what. They're going to eat the brassicas no matter what. But the more water is in that plant, the better that leaf is. Obviously, the caterpillar itself is getting more good things. I've definitely reared caterpillars that I gave leaves that got dry, and they'll still eat them, but it's not good. And so probably because they can, their growth is based on what they're eating and temperatures and all kinds of things. So all of a sudden they're eating a lot more because the plant itself has, potentially more of what they need, like water in it.
That makes sense. Any other questions? Did we spark any additional? Kacie, I'm curious what the flowers are. These marigolds on the bottom of the strawberries in this photo?
I believe so. And what's interesting about those is that at the time, those were planted to prevent, whether we were going to have spider mite issues, whether we were going to have aphid issues, they were meant to bring in natural enemies. And you can't see it at the bottom of the picture on the left that's all sad from spider mites. But the marigolds were also covered in spider mites. The spider mites were just like, I like everything here. And so we ended up releasing the Phytocilus persimilis, which is the predatory mite that targets two-spotted spider mite. And this was then, after we pulled out the dead leaves and everything over time, they did their job. And then the one on the right is what these strawberry towers look like after.
Wow, they bounced back that much.
It worked beautifully, but it took some time because it's biological control. So I was talking to Bronwyn, who runs the center down there at Dixon Springs, and she was like, it still looks bad. It still looks bad. Should we do something? I was like, let's just wait, hold. And so then it went, because the plants continued to fall to look worse, and then they rebounded and, looked beautiful.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, no, it was really cool. So if you have spider mite trouble and you want to use biocontrol, Phytocilus persimilis is your answer. It's one that actually works really beautifully.
Rachel has asked if you guys have any reading recommendations for guides on companion plants, trap crops, and even just basic pest encyclopedias with photos of the pests in different life stages.
I use this book quite a lot. I find that's pretty effective. I'm sure Kacie has way more resources. Yeah, other than this, like Google is kind of my go-to. I like this one because it gives you the actual crops and then the potential pests that are associated with that crop, rather than just, photos of pests that I have no frame of reference for. But yeah, I find Google searches, with a little bit of like critical thinking.
Yeah,
Can you say the name of that book? Someone asked.
Yeah, so it's actually a fairly old book. There's probably newer books that are better, but it's called The Organic Gardener's Handbook of Natural Insect and Disease Control. It's by Rodale.
It's the Rodale, yeah, of course.
Yeah, so.
I was going to mention that, yes, so when you're looking at control things and you're looking at the internet, anything that's an extension publication from a surrounding state is a great one to start with. And then, as far as pictures and a book that's going to mention all the crops that something might be in, the one that I use is the Garden Insects of North America. And it's big, Ultimate Guide to Backyard Bugs. Obviously you can see I've got lots of tabs in it. And it has so many different insects, and often has pictures of the damage that goes with it, different life stages. It is divided by what the insects are doing. So like chapter 2 is insects that chew on leaves and needles. So, it's not divided taxonomically. It's not like, here's all the caterpillars and here's all the Garden Insects of North America is Whitney Crenshaw and David Shelter. Let me put that in there. Let's see.
Evan, I did write this in here. I'm curious that is yours by Fern Marshall Bragley. Is that the same book? Is that the author? The Organic Gardener's Handbook of. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. And then I put that one in there. And then, yeah, trying to think if there's anything, I think some of the books like that, Organic Gardener's Handbook, some of these other things, again, because I have that one too up on my bookshelf, just looking at more than one source about a thing. And again, a lot of stuff somebody else might have really good luck with, and you might try and find out it doesn't work for you. And I think a lot of the things that are recommended in a lot of these books, something that I was trying to do in my research and as I go forward is to take some of these recommendations and try to test them and see, if we subject it to actual replicated study, do we find the same relationships that, growers find, that sort of thing. And so one of the first things I did was look at no-till in cucumbers and tomatoes, and whether or not just doing essentially no-till in ground covers would reduce pest numbers, because that's a claim. And for us, it largely did not, but it didn't make it worse. So it was kind of neutral on the pest numbers, but we weren't taking into account, obviously, all the other things that reduced tillage, does for your farm.
Yeah, I definitely find myself trying to find consensuses more than, referring to one piece of reference material. Like I found a lot of like there's some Johnny's research that they put out on some beneficials and trap crops that I found helpful. But then seeing that reflected in other people having success of it. Like I use Sweet Alyssum with tomatoes is just like sort of like a generally known consensus, it seems at this point, that works on most people's operations. But like Kacie said, it is so contextual as to whether it'll work, on in your own space. But I also think it's like, it doesn't hurt anything. Sweet Alyssum seed costs nothing.
Yep.
Can't hurt to plant flowers right next to your tomatoes. I mean, so if it's cheap and you could see slight benefits from it, yeah, it's worth a try.
It's good for the natural enemies in the area, right? So they are going to be getting nectar and things out of those, even if that doesn't translate into those guys actually doing anything in your crop. And I don't think there's any evidence that Sweet Alyssum makes in open fields, it doesn't matter. In protected culture, sometimes we worry about flowers actually making pest problems worse because things like thrips like the flowers and then move into the crop.
That's a good point.
But in an open field situation, you're not as worried about thrips and those production systems. And yeah, it is really it can't hurt. If you have space for it, why not?
Do you want to be respectful of everyone's time, including our generous host today? Does anybody have any final questions or any last points, Evan or Kacie, that you want to share? Oh, it looks like Emily did just drop any suggestions on root crop damage for turnings. I think I am seeing nematode damage.
Yeah, I've had that issue too. I assume this is turnips, but I find I can never really tell if it's nematode damage or wireworm damage. But yeah, they get into the roots of the turnips, and I haven't found a solution for that yet. And it mostly only happens in the summer and then the fall, like the early fall, and then the late fall plantings are a lot nicer. That's one of those things that I kind of tend to just overplant turnips. And actually, one thing I mentioned in the slides at one point is kind of educating your consumer, and that being kind of a pest management strategy, them being okay purchasing a bunch of radishes with a few holes in it within reason, of course, if it's too bad. But some wireworm damage on turnips, if it's really bad, then you might just have to, not sell it and call it call it done. But otherwise, you know, if there's a little bit, or catching it early where you can just clear the crop out and try to get however much money you can for it before it gets really bad. But otherwise, I've heard of people using nematodes to address wireworm issues, I believe. But yeah, unfortunately that is, and I've seen like super nice farms, like all those fancy Instagram farms, you know, and they like showing their market display, and even some of their turnips have wireworm damage on it. And so I'm like, well, I guess it might just be one of those pests that like everyone kind of has to deal with, and it's so different with the hatching cycles of the pests that there's not a super like best practice on it, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would tend to agree that I think the best way to deal with things like that is to try to get consumers not to care about it. That's how I feel about corn earworm in sweet corn too. If there's one
exactly.
caterpillar, I just wish everybody would calm down and just take the caterpillar out.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, I'm a strong proponent of no, this is fine. It doesn't change the taste or anything. It's fine.
I think we'll wrap up here unless, thank you for the information. That's all. So yeah, I think we will, we'll end here. I did, put a link to a short survey. There's only 5 questions. I would really appreciate your feedback for future webinars like this. And then also I did share both Kacie and Evan's emails if you want to follow up and have any direct questions for them. Additionally, the Idea Farm Network listserv is available. You can find it via Google, but Evan right now for this year is kind of monitoring that. So if you have any questions, he will likely see that, and you can direct them at him or whatnot. But there's also some information there as well that you can share with other farmers in your area, or just post a picture of a bug or something like that if you're, you know, outside of Facebook groups. That listserv does exist as well. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Kacie. Thank you, Evan. And yeah, I hope you guys learned something, and you can turn it around and use it in your fields moving forward. Thanks so much.